1975 when he sort of burst on the scene with a book called Art as a Medium of Social Conflict, Picture Wars, from the late antique to the Hussite Revolution. This was a revolutionary work in itself. It goes on to a major monograph on one of the most extraordinary monuments and mysterious, deliberately mysterious monuments of the Renaissance, the great garden, the Sacro Bosco, the holy forest at Bomarzo, which is by far the cutting edge of interpretation of this mysterious work. Sandro Botticelli's Primavera, where Primavera becomes what it really is, a piece of Medici propaganda. He has a book on the antiquity and the automaton, in which the 18th century nostalgia for antiquity went so far as to try to recreate it with little people and big people who moved automatically. He has a book on Florentine football, and I really mean it, football in Florence in the Renaissance as a kind of also a piece of Medici propaganda. He's quite a footballer himself. When he was here for a term, he started what I seem to remember is the first football game out on our campus. He has a new thing out right now in which, on the imagery of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, in which that work is put in a very new kind of context. Horst, I have to shut up. Come and talk. Thank you.
Terrible. Should I answer? Thank you, my father. Thank you very much for this introduction. I excuse my terribly banal title that has been changed into merely 2 words, sketch act. Sketch act. My first point, please, the first 2 slides. Among the many accounts of artistic rivalry of the 16th century, the one that divided Benvenuto Cellini and Baccio Bandinelli is as extreme as illuminating. According to Cellini's Vita, one of their public disputes was occasioned by Bandinelli's group of Hercules and Cacus for Florence's Piazza della Signoria. Cellini states that everything Bandinelli, quote, views is transformed in his repulsive gaze into something most vile, even if it is highly beautiful. Were Hercules' hair shaved off, he would be left with a skull too small to hold his brain. It is impossible to discern whether his face is a human countenance or that of a bullock. The head is affixed clumsily to the neck, displaying so little artistry and so much ugliness that one really has never seen anything worse, etc., etc. Cellini asserted that Bandinelli could summon up virtually no response to refute this. All he exclaimed was, "Ah, you who speak only ill, and what about my design? Ahi, cattiva linguaccia, e dove lascia il mio disegno?" It is an astounding statement, for it sets the preliminary sketch against the finished work. The conventional elements of the comparison are inverted, for Bandinelli believes that the sketch and not the work as executed should be judged. So this is just a comment to the last statement. Left, the status thus accorded to the drawing is commensurate with Bandinelli's self-portrait in Boston, in which he appears as the proud bearer of the Order of Santiago, awarded to him shortly before. He points with his right hand towards a large sketch of Hercules and Cacus, which differs substantially from the completed sculpture. The painting conveys the impression that Bandinelli is seeking here to stylize himself as the grand master of the sketch, just as he strove to do vis-à-vis Cellini. As to date, only Irving Lavin has pointed out, Bandinelli's desire to accord greater significance to the sketch than to sculptures in marble was not grounded in his alleged shortcomings as a sculptor. Instead, for him the sketch is superior as it is closer than the sculptures to the imagination of the artist who created it. Bandinelli required his sketches to be more forceful and, at the very least, more accessible to critical judgment than marble figures. His designs overshadow the matter. Second, the sketch as raptus. Both, please. Bandinelli's statement marks the conclusion of a lengthy process reflected in art history by decades of controversy on the elevated status accorded to sketches. Even supporters of an early development of autonomous drawings agree that the notion of the sketch does not come to a full theoretical expression until Leonardo da Vinci's exhortation to artists not to execute, quote, the individual parts and limbs with precisely delineated forms, end quote. Artists should instead tentatively grope their way towards the equivalence with types of emotion and corporeal form. It is in this framework that Leonardo speaks of his works of art as creations in the fullest sense of this term. Quote, if a painter wishes to see beauties so lovely that he will fall in love with them, then he is able to create just that. And if he wishes to see eerie objects that will scare him, or strange, ridiculous, or really pitiful figures, then he can conjure them up as Lord and God, end quote. It is easy to criticize this statement and as an illusion, for there can never be a totally valid representation of three-dimensional reality, haptic reality on a flat surface. Both, however, Leonardo's following almost delirious verbal invocation of the destructive forces of nature expresses a realization that there are powers so violent that they cannot be fully grasped by the senses, whereas drawing does make this possible. Leonardo asserts that images are more than simply the illusion of real presence. They constitute instead a force that so defines human existence and actions as to fully captivate the viewer through an, quote, effective raptus. The destructive side of this phenomenon is represented in those powerful images forbidden in Plato's Republic, which is tumultuous nature provokes madness in man. Hence it is true that while Leonardo's flood pieces, as Frank Fehrenbach put it in his fundamental study, do, quote, mimic a fictitious event, by however conveying this with maximum impetu, they are imperceptibly transformed into reality, the reality of an endless mobile gaze that finds no place to rest, end quote. Third point, sketch act. Both. Leonardo held painting in greater esteem than poetry as a result of this motion. Here he may have been guided by Alberti's self-portrait, in which a flying eye projected from the straight lines of the neck, replacing the Adam's apple as the organ of speech. Drawings take primacy over writing for Leonardo. However, they are close to a certain capability of language. Although I do not generally advocate transposing linguistic terminology to the fine arts, in this instance, a comparison with the theory of speech act might be helpful. This term was coined ingeniously by Wittgenstein and then further developed by John Austin and John Searle. Speech acts are sentences that create facts simply by being pronounced. For instance, in christening a ship, I name this ship Queen Elizabeth. Analogously to this mechanism, one might, with Leonardo's theory of the effective raptus in mind, speak of a sketch act, the power of the sketch as fulfilled action. Leonardo's effective raptus one could estimate again as a constructive product of a man who wanted to heroize himself as a moving divine force. But an example from the other end of the scale of possibilities shows that the connection between drawing and action was seen to become so dense that the sketch even could be omitted in the name of direct action. It stems again from Cellini's Vita, and thus I come to point 4, sketch act as tyrannicide. Both. After Cellini had produced the glorious medal for Pope Clement VII, he was commissioned to immortalize the young Count Alessandro de Medici in a similar work, Left. The reverse side medal was to be designed by the gifted and rebellious Lorenzino de Medici, right, who had, quote, killed some of the busts on the Arch of Constantine. He had been sentenced to death for his iconoclastic patricide, but was then merely being exiled from Rome to Florence. Choosing Lorenzino to design the reverse of the medal was clearly ill-advised. At first, he took his time. When Cellini pressed him, Lorenzino responded that he was working day and night to draft this sketch of a figure. The whole world would notice his design, right? Lorenzino did as he promised, replacing the scribe and the draughtman's pen with a dagger and stabbing the Duke of Medici, whom he and others detested as a tyrant of the vilest type, and then made the reverse of his own medal with the two Brutus knives. Cellini tells how the Republican Francesco Soderini burst into his atelier, leaping for joy when news of the assassination broke, and cried out, "That's the reverse of the medal your Lorenzino promised you for that criminal tyrant." Soderini had realized immediately that the act and the design coincide, for the act took the place of the figure. Alessandro de Medici's assassination perfected the sketch as a murderous deed. Leonardo's affective raptus and Lorenzino's murder constitute the extremes of the disegno as an act working either inside the brain or as a deadly expansion of the corpus. Point 5, the architectural sketch as tabula rasa, left. A form that is able to bridge both extremes is manifested specially in architectural sketches, as it becomes particularly clear in the history of the building of New St. Peter's, the paradigm of all modern construction. I came up against this phenomenon when I attempted to describe the sequence not as the history of various different constructions, but rather as an implacable succession of compulsive acts of demolition. I had noticed that since the time of Julius II, every single pope dreamt at the start of his pontificate of destroying parts of the former buildings in order to symbolize their conquest of Rome. This process kept architects in work for generations, not just constructing, but also tearing parts of the building down. And numerous architects supported and fomented it with a panoply of sketches. Here, the disegno had its most sweeping impact as sketch act, right? Onofrio Panvinio narrates how Bramante persuaded Pope Julius II to take the still incomprehensible step of tearing down the old Basilica of St. Peter's. At times he showed the Pope ground plans, at times sketches, urged him incessantly and assured him the undertaking would bring him great renown. What, end quote. The reference to Bramante's talent for rhetoric is preceded by a multitude of sketches and ground plans which speak for themselves. Vasari explains elsewhere, the drafts of that architecture are formed of nothing but lines, which are the beginning and end of this art for the architect, for everything remaining expressed in wooden models, developed from these lines, is simply the work of stonemasons and bricklayers. In drawing this distinction between lines and wooden models, Vasari was of course taking a stab at professional architects as represented by Antonio da Sangallo, later chief architect of St. Peter's, but that is not the crux of the matter. A construction such as Bramante's vellum plan derives its force from the precious material employed and the differentiated magnificence with which the autonomous calm of its appearance is executed. It is architecture complete in itself, and it preserves the grandiose notion of a phase in the project. Although it was not actually realized, this design fulfills its conceptual role as a sketch act inasmuch as it determined the direction in which thinking on the project evolved and the way in which the building was constructed. Left. Bramante's crossing piers in his famous Uffizi 28 drawing do not, of course, simply symbolize the new St. Peter's project, but eliminate the fundamental forms of the preceding buildings, which James Ackerman showed in Washington already. They reveal the mechanism of the design. It functions not simply by imagining the unthinkable, but by elevating this to the status of a practicable project, placing it above the status quo through the movement of the eyes. This is the point Panvino touched upon and the message conveyed by Vasari. Architectural sketches of this type are in a certain sense, trials of courage given material expression. Right? The nervous and spontaneous individuality of Bramante's sketch reveals the most extreme form of sketch's ability, for it endows the will to destroy with the most durable form of existence. Bramante, working here in a zigzag line and using every stronger strokes, developed his canonical form of the crossing pier, sunk into the flesh of the old basilica like a stake. These crossing piers determined the dimensions and positioning of all future plans. They are the sign that the old basilica must vanish completely. And nothing left, please. And so this is this, and right, please. And nothing is as suggestive as the southeast crossing pier, which conceptually already gnawed away at the columns in Constantine's basilica as we see them here. Once let loose upon the world as a drawn image, this vision clearly generated an electric charge that simply had to be discharged. Old St. Peter's fate was sealed. My sixth and last point, architecture as sketch. One might interpret Bramante's sketch act as a standard procedure adopted by any suggestive design, but it reveals much more. Vasari's assertion that architecture is the art of sketching and designing also had an impact on the new buildings, left and right. Bramante clearly applied this principle to his work and built with the lightness of a draft in exploratory mode. He was never constrained by any doubt that sections already built or under construction could not be knocked down again. He was well aware when he constructed his unwanted west core that it would be demolished, which indeed occurred in 1585. And left, please. And the same applied to the grandiose shelter edifice around the altar of St. Peter's, ripped down in 1592. What we are looking at here are constructions that were still partly temporary, destined right from the outset for demolition. However, this does not apply to Raphael's ambulatory and the southern transept, rebuilt and constructed on by Antonio da Sangallo. The first thing Michelangelo did to the building, however, was to tear this down, along with all the other elements added under Sangallo, almost all. Vehement complaints that demolishing parts of the building was a waste of construction monies were simply swept aside. This indicates that the newly constructed sections were not seen as cumbersome works of architecture, but were viewed instead as ephemeral structures like sketches, left and right. This included the elimination of Michelangelo's grandiose, compact attic in the south of the basilica. Here we have the drawing of Hank Millen and Craig Smythe, their reconstruction, replaced by Piero Ligorio's complex band pierced by windows, which now runs round the entire building. Here the sketch act displays its furious power, not simply as a conceptual fundament for a new solution, but equally as the freedom to tear down the new sections oneself. The sketch as a sketch act has pulled the physical presence of stone on the level of ephemeral lines drawn on paper. Left and right, my last slides. Taking Bandinelli's superiority of the drawing as my starting point, I have attempted to demonstrate that the sketch can function as a sketch act within and without the brain. We have explored the vigorous effect of such designs with reference to Leonardo's flood works, the reverse of Cellini's medal for Alessandro de Medici, and plans of New St. Peter's. These are highly diverse fields, but precisely this heterogeneity may suggest that the processes described reveal more than a merely 16th century phenomenon. Indeed, we have reason to believe that the observer's relationship to the sketch per se is encapsulated in these processes. Sketches are endowed with a force of conviction so strong that at times, thanks to their proximity to the imagination, both in creation and in the consequences of implementation, it takes on a physical force. I come to the end. My sketch on the sketch as act tried to develop one singular aspect which is contradictory to all we heard about sketches as members of an evolutionary process. Instead, I tried to hint on paradigmatic events in which drawings cut through the narrative of their own medium in order to jump out of the framework and attract and activate the brain, the physical world, and symposia. Thank you.